In 1933, a schoolteacher in the hill country lost her job, her savings, and her husband in the same winter. She had two daughters, a wood stove, a pantry with almost nothing in it, and a decision to make every single night. What do I put in the pot when there is nothing left to put in it? She made 15 soups that winter, all of them with 3 ingredients or less, some of them with ingredients most people would have thrown away. Potato peels, stale bread, weeds from the yard. She rotated them night after night, stretching each one as far as it could go, feeding her girls with food that had no right to be as filling as it was. Her youngest daughter, decades later, told a church group that she did not realize they were poor until she was grown. The soup was always warm, the kitchen was always full of steam, and her mother never once sat down at that table without something in every bowl. That teacher's most desperate recipe, the one she made on the nights when the pantry was truly bare, is number 1 on this list. And the soup at number 7 kept more sick and elderly people alive through hard winters than almost anything a doctor could have prescribed. These are 15 soups, 3 ingredients each. Water and salt do not count, all of them forgotten. All of them built to keep families standing when the world was trying to push them down. Number 15. Pumpkin and milk soup. Before pumpkin became a seasonal flavor, before it became a color on a coffee cup, it was survival. Plain and simple. The large orange squash that grew easily in almost any soil and stored for months in a root cellar without spoiling. A piece of pumpkin, peeled and cubed, milk, butter, that was the whole recipe. You simmered the pumpkin in the milk until it fell apart on its own, mashed it with a wooden spoon right there in the pot, and stirred in the butter at the end. 10 minutes of standing, 1 pot. A soup so smooth and sweet you did not need a single spice to make it taste like something worth eating. Frontier families, the ones who lived where the roads ended and the nearest neighbor was a half-day's walk, planted pumpkins because they were reliable. They grew large. They stored long. And when January came and the cellar was down to its last reserves, a pumpkin and a splash of milk meant the difference between supper and silence. The irony is quiet but heavy. The same vegetable that once kept families alive through the coldest months is now a decoration people throw away the day after a holiday. The pumpkin did not change. We did. Number 14. Egg drop broth. A pot of boiling broth. Any broth, even water with a little fat in it. 2 eggs, a pinch of pepper, 60 seconds from start to bowl. You cracked the eggs into a cup, beat them quickly with a fork, and poured them in a thin stream into the rolling liquid while stirring slowly with your other hand. The eggs set instantly, golden ribbons unfurling through the broth like silk threads dropped into warm water. A pinch of pepper. Done. This crossed every community, every tradition, every kitchen that ever faced the question of feeding a family fast with almost nothing on hand. Immigrant families from the eastern harbors brought their own versions. Farm wives in the heartland made it without knowing anyone else did. It appeared independently in kitchens that had never spoken to one another because the logic was universal. Eggs are cheap, broth is free if you save your bones, and hunger does not wait for a complicated recipe. For someone too tired to stand, too sick to chew, or too old to manage anything more involved than cracking 2 eggs, this was not just a meal, it was permission to keep going. A hot bowl that asked nothing of you and gave back everything. Number 13. Parsnip soup. When was the last time you saw a parsnip? Most people alive today have never cooked one. Some have never even held one. It looks like a pale carrot that forgot to develop color, cream white, tapered, unremarkable. And yet, before 1900, it was one of the most common root vegetables on this continent. It grew in almost any soil. It survived frost. It stored in cold ground through the winter without rotting. And it made a soup so naturally sweet that children ate it without complaint, which, for any parent who has tried to feed a child from an empty pantry, is worth more than flavor. It is a small miracle. Parsnips, onion, butter. Peeled and simmered until soft, then mashed into a smooth, pale soup that tasted like the earth had decided to be generous for once. The natural sugars in the parsnip deepened as it cooked, caramelizing slightly at the edges of the pot, giving the broth a richness that had no business being there. Colonial families grew them by the acre. They were as essential as potatoes. more so in some regions because they were sweeter and easier to digest. And then, sometime in the early 20th century, they simply vanished from the common table, replaced by easier-to-market vegetables, forgotten by grocery stores that had no use for something that ugly and that cheap. The parsnip did not go extinct. It just stopped being wanted. The wisdom of growing it, cooking it, and feeding a family with it for pennies, that is what went extinct. Number 12. Cornmeal drop soup. In the mountains and the old mountains, the ones that time seemed to forget, cornmeal was currency. You could not always get flour, you could not always get rice, but cornmeal was ground locally, sold cheaply, and kept in a tin on every kitchen shelf from the first frost to the last thaw. This soup was born in those kitchens. A pot of boiling water or broth. A bowl of cornmeal mixed with 1 beaten egg into a thick, sticky batter. You scooped spoonfuls of that batter and dropped them into the simmering liquid. They sank first, then rose to the surface as they cooked. Small, dense dumplings that absorbed the flavor of whatever broth they landed in. Cornmeal, egg, broth. That was the whole thing. 5 minutes of preparation, 10 minutes of simmering, and a bowl of something warm and filling that stuck with you through a cold afternoon of hard work. The women who made this did not call them dumplings. They called them drops. "I made drops tonight," they would say, and everyone at the table knew exactly what that meant. It meant the pantry was thin, but nobody was going to bed hungry. It meant the cornmeal tin was doing its job. It meant another night survived without complaint. Number 11, salt pork and cabbage soup. Salt pork existed for one reason: to last. Packed in salt, stored in a crock, it could sit for months. It was dense, salty, fatty, and it was the only meat poor families could reliably keep through winter. A piece no bigger than a fist went into a pot of water, simmered until the salt leached out and the fat rendered. Then a quartered cabbage, a diced potato, 40 minutes. The cabbage turned silky. The potato thickened the broth. The salt pork gave everything its flavor, even though the piece itself was barely enough to notice. That was the point. The pork was not the meal. The pork was the engine. One fist-sized piece flavored a pot that fed a family for 2 days. The math was not complicated. It was beautiful. Every soup on this list has 3 ingredients. That number is not accidental. It is the architecture of poverty cooking. 3 is the maximum you can count on having when the pantry is bare. The genius of these soups is not what they include, it is what they leave out. The fewer ingredients a recipe requires, the more people can make it. The more people who can make it, the fewer go hungry. That is survival arithmetic. Share this video, hit subscribe. Tell me in the comments which of these your family made, Marascan, because these recipes are disappearing, and the only thing keeping them alive is the people who remember them. The next 5 surprised me most. Number 7 was given to people who could barely lift a spoon. Number 6 turned something most kitchens throw away into a meal. Stay with me. Number 10. Rice water soup. This was not rice cooked until fluffy and served on a plate. This was rice drowned. A small handful of grains in a large pot of water, or bone broth, simmered until the rice dissolved and the liquid turned thick, white, and starchy. More porridge than soup. More remedy than meal, except nobody called it a remedy. They called it what you make when someone cannot hold anything else down. A handful of rice, broth or water, a thin slice of ginger root if you had it, and most families did because ginger was one of the few spices that grew in kitchen window boxes and lasted dried for months. Workers who built the railroads through the mountains and deserts brought this tradition with them. They taught it to the families in the towns they passed through, and those families taught it to their neighbors. And within a generation it had traveled far beyond the communities where it began. By the 1940s, mothers across the industrial corridors were making it for sick children without knowing where the recipe came from. They just knew it worked. The starchy broth settled the stomach. The warmth spread through the body. And the ginger, sharp and bright, cut through whatever fog the body was carrying. It cost nearly nothing. A tablespoon of rice, a cup of broth made from saved bones, a coin-sized piece of dried ginger. That was the entire investment for a soup that brought people back to themselves when nothing else could. Number 9. Turnip and onion soup. Ask someone under 40 what a turnip tastes like, and they will not be able to tell you. Ask someone over 70 and watch their face change. There is a memory in that vegetable, not always a good one. Turnips meant hard times. Turnips meant the potatoes were gone and the garden had nothing left but root vegetables too tough and bitter for anyone's first choice. But toughness was the whole point. Turnips, onion, lard or bacon drippings, peeled, sliced thin, and simmered together in one pot until the turnip softened and lost its bitterness, turning mild and slightly sweet when given enough time and heat. The onion melted into the broth. The lard gave it body and a richness that tricked the tongue into thinking this was a more substantial meal than it actually was. Rural families planted turnips as insurance. They grew in poor soil. They survived early frost. They kept in root cellars for months without any preservation beyond darkness and cool air. A turnip was not a choice. A turnip was a backup plan. And when the backup plan was all you had, this soup was what it became. Nobody celebrates the turnip. Nobody puts it on a restaurant menu without apologizing for it first. But it fed more families through more lean winters than any vegetable anyone bothers to remember. It deserves better than forgetting. Number 8. Tomato and stale bread soup. The bread was never fresh. That was the rule. Stale bread, the heels, the hardened slices too dry to serve at the table, had a second life. And its second life was this soup. A can of crushed tomatoes, stale bread torn into rough pieces, a clove of garlic, into a pot with enough water to cover. 20 minutes, and the bread dissolved into the broth, thickening it into something between a soup and a porridge. Warm, filling, and strangely satisfying for something made entirely from leftovers. Families who arrived through the eastern harbors brought this in their memories the way others brought photographs. It traveled through tenement hallways, through neighborhoods where 5 languages were spoken on a single block, and the only one everyone shared was hunger. A woman who grew up eating this said the secret was never to use fresh bread. Fresh bread falls apart wrong. Stale bread absorbs, it becomes the soup. That distinction between falling apart and absorbing is not just a cooking tip, it is a philosophy. Number 7. Milk toast soup. This is the one from the beginning of this video, the one that kept more people fed through weakness and age than almost anything else a kitchen could produce. Stale bread, warm milk, butter. You heated the milk gently, never a boil. Tore the bread into pieces, laid them in a bowl, poured the warm milk over, and let it soak until everything softened. A pat of butter on top, melting slowly into the surface. No cooking beyond warming the milk, no knife, no cutting board. A person with trembling hands could make this sitting down. Milk toast was the meal you gave someone who could not eat anything else. The grandmother whose appetite had vanished. The widower who had not cooked in 50 years. It asked nothing, required nothing, and delivered the faint sweetness of butter melting into warm bread, which, for someone who had stopped tasting food weeks ago, was enough to bring them back to the table one more day. Then, sometime in the last century, it simply stopped being made, replaced by nothing, just forgotten. The simplest, gentlest meal ever invented. Too simple and too gentle to bother remembering. Number 6. Crackling and potato soup. Nothing left the kitchen. Nothing. When a family rendered pork fat to produce lard, the crispy golden bits left behind were called cracklings. In a wealthy kitchen, they were a snack. In a poor kitchen, they were an ingredient too valuable to eat by the handful. Cracklings, potatoes, onion. The potatoes simmered until soft. The onion dissolved into the broth. The cracklings went in last, golden, salty fragments that held enough texture to make every spoonful feel substantial. The pig fed the family, the fat became cooking oil. The scraps from the fat became cracklings. The cracklings became soup, every stage honored, every scrap used. The byproduct of a byproduct turned into a meal a family looked forward to eating. That is not quaint. That is extraordinary. Let me be direct. These soups will never trend. Nobody will photograph them from above with a decorative sprig on the rim. Some of them are barely recognizable as meals by modern standards. But they are the reason you exist. Somewhere in your family line, 2 generations back, maybe 3, someone made one of these. They stood at a stove that gave more smoke than heat, and turned 3 ingredients into the meal that got their family through another night. If that person had given up, the chain that leads to you sitting here would have broken. These soups are not recipes. They are links. Every one that gets forgotten is a link that rusts and falls away. Leave a like on this video. Ask someone who remembers these. Tonight, before the memory fades, and stay, the final 5 are the hardest to talk about. Number 3 is the poorest soup that ever existed. Number 1 is the meal people made on the night before there was nothing left at all. Number 5. Bean liquor broth. The first rule of a kitchen that understood hunger was this: never pour anything down the drain. When a pot of beans finished cooking, the liquid left behind was not waste. It was not dirty water. It was a broth, starchy, dense, faintly smoky if the beans had been cooked with any kind of pork, and it was the foundation of tomorrow's supper. Bean liquor. Onion, a piece of salt pork. The liquid was reheated in the same pot, the onion diced and simmered in it, and the salt pork dropped in for flavor. 30 minutes, and a kitchen that had already used its beans for one meal had produced a second meal from what most people would have washed down the sink. In the rural stretches of the southern lowlands, this was as common as breathing. Women did not think of it as clever. They thought of it as obvious. Throwing away bean water was like throwing away money, and they had no money to throw. The broth was rich with everything the beans had released during cooking: starch, salt, and the deep, earthy flavor of whatever legume had been in the pot. Pinto, navy, black-eyed, each one produced a slightly different liquor, and each one became a slightly different soup. The variety was accidental. The nourishment was not. Number 4. Dandelion green soup. Every spring, yards and empty lots burst with a plant that most people poison, mow, or curse at. Bright yellow flowers on stubborn stems that push through sidewalk cracks and any surface that tries to keep them down. Dandelions. The most abundant free food that has ever grown on this continent, and almost nobody eats them anymore. During the hardest years, women walked through their yards at dawn with a paring knife and a basket, cutting the young leaves before the sun made them bitter. Those leaves went straight into a pot with diced potato and a spoonful of bacon fat. 15 minutes. The greens wilted dark green. The potato thickened the broth. The bacon fat softened the bitterness into something warm and filling. The dandelion did not ask to be planted. It did not need watering or attention. It simply grew, stubbornly, everywhere, like a promise that no matter how bare the cupboard got, the earth itself would provide something. All you had to do was bend down and pick it. Number 3. Flour and water soup. This is the poorest soup on this list. The one made by people who had nothing else. Literally nothing else. Flour, butter or lard. Water. You melted the fat in a pot. You stirred in the flour until it toasted golden, releasing a nutty smell that made the kitchen feel less desperate than it was. Then you added water slowly, stirring to prevent lumps, until the pot held a thin, pale broth that looked like almost nothing, and tasted like almost nothing, and was the only thing standing between a family and an empty stomach. Immigrant families brought this recipe in their bones. They called it by different names depending on where their grandmothers came from. But the recipe was identical everywhere. Flour, fat, water. The 3 things any household, no matter how poor, could find. It was not delicious. Nobody pretended it was. But it was warm, and the toasted flour gave the body something to burn through the night. For a child who had not eaten since morning, this was not hardship. It was supper, and supper, no matter how thin, was the difference between a family that held together and one that did not. Number 2. Potato peel soup. This soup was made from garbage. There is no gentler way to say it. Potato peels, onion, bacon grease. You saved the peels throughout the day. When enough had accumulated, you dropped them into a pot with a diced onion and a spoonful of bacon drippings. Water to cover. Simmer until the starch thickened the broth into something that looked, if you squinted, like actual potato soup. It did not taste like potato soup. It tasted like the memory of potato soup. Thinner, earthier, with the mineral edge the skin carries and the flesh does not. But it was warm. And it came from something that would have been thrown away, which meant the potatoes themselves could be saved for tomorrow's stew. The peels became soup tonight. 1 vegetable, 2 meals. Nothing wasted. Women who made this did not share it proudly. Some were ashamed of it. But they made it anyway. Because shame does not fill a bowl and pride does not keep a child from going hungry. Before we reach number 1, I need you to hear this. The school teacher from the opening of this video made every soup on this list. All 15. She rotated them based on what she had. Pumpkin when the cellar still held squash. Cornmeal drops when the tin was not empty. Bean liquor when the beans were gone but the water remained. And when there was nothing left, she made the soup that is number 1. Her daughters never knew it was desperation. They thought it was dessert. Subscribe now if you have not. This channel exists to keep these recipes alive. Number 1. Vinegar and bread soup. A heel of stale bread, a splash of vinegar, a spoonful of sugar or honey. That was the last meal before nothing. The one made on the night when the pantry was empty, the money was gone, and the only things left in the kitchen were bread too hard to chew, and a bottle of vinegar nobody had thought to use until now. You tore the bread into pieces. You poured warm water over it, a splash of vinegar to cut the staleness, sugar or honey to make it possible for a child to eat without crying. That was supper. Diaries from the hardest years mention this meal more than almost any other. Women wrote about it without detail, as if the words were too heavy. Made the bread and vinegar again tonight. No recipe, no quantities. Just the acknowledgement that this was what was left. It is the floor, the absolute floor of what a family can eat and still call it a meal. Not a recipe. A testament to the stubborn private act of putting something in a bowl and sitting down and eating it because that is what you do. You do not give up. You do not lay down. You find bread. You find vinegar. You find a reason to keep going, and you eat. 15 soups, 3 ingredients each. None of them beautiful, all of them essential. The pumpkin soup that kept frontier families alive through January. The egg drop broth that took 60 seconds and asked nothing of you. The parsnip that vanished from every kitchen and deserves to come back. The dandelion greens that grew free in every yard and fed anyone willing to bend down and pick them. The flour and water that was the poorest meal a family could make and still the one that held them together. And the bread and vinegar that said, "Tonight we eat, no matter what. Tonight we eat." If your grandmother made any of these, you carry something most people have lost. Not a recipe. A memory. A link to a time when cooking was not a hobby or trend or content for a screen. It was the single most important act a person could perform. The act of feeding someone. The act of refusing to let the table go empty. Make one of these this week. The simplest one. The one you already have the ingredients for. And when you sit down to eat it, sit at the table. Not the couch, the table. Because that is where these soups belong. I see you at a table eaten slowly by a person who understands that the simplest food, made with the least, can still be an act of quiet, stubborn, unbreakable strength. Tell me in the comments which one you are making. Tell me which one your grandmother made. Tell me the name she called it if she called it anything at all. Because these soups are not just food. They are proof that your family survived. And that proof is worth more than any recipe ever written.